We're here at the banks of Dead Sea in Jordan, and I'm delighted to introduce to you His Royal Highness Prince Ghazi to deliver our first Life Worth Living lecture. Prince Ghazi is Chief Advisor to His Majesty the King Abdullah of Jordan. He's advisor for religious and cultural affairs, as well as the personal envoy of the King. Prince Ghazi teaches also Islamic philosophy at the University of Jordan. Welcome, Prince Ghazi.
Bismillahirrahmanirrahim. Walhamdulillah. Wassalatu wassalamu ala khatim anbiya wal mursaleen. So I was kind of asked by my friend Professor Miroslav Volf to give a talk on the theme of life worth living, and another little talk on my book, What is Islam and Why? So I'm going to try and combine them into one lecture, as the two are obviously related, at least from the Islamic point of view. Obviously, I'm not going to cover both these topics in such a brief lecture, but I hope to be able to whet your appetites on both subjects. So for the first part, I'm going to deal with the first question, life worth living, from a general, objective, as it were, philosophical point of view, not as a Muslim specifically, but academically. And then for the second part, I'm going to try and sketch Islam's particular answer to this question. The question itself, life worth living. Before starting, there are two little caveats which I have to mention as regards life worth living as such. The first is that, in a sense, you don't have a choice. No one does. You can choose to make your life worth living, to you, philosophically speaking, but you cannot choose to live another life other than your own. That's impossible. You can't choose to be a lion prowling the savannah for wildebeests, or a wonderful alien life form in the Andromeda galaxy, or to go back in time and be the Emperor Marcus Aurelius. So strictly speaking, the question isn't life worth living, because there's no choice about that. It's making life worth living, specifically making your life worth living. So this is an academic topic. It's not an optional course at Yale, and it's not a course you can take pass-fail. This is about your life, right now, for real, the one and only chance you'll ever get. This brings me to the second point. Miroslav and I here in this wonderful surroundings, and you in the Ivy League ivory tower, have the luxury of thinking about what makes life worth living and how to make your lives worth living, but many people don't. There are many people that exist in intolerable pain through no fault of their own, in illness, in thirst, in starvation, in fear, in heat, in cold, in humiliation, in physical disability, in old age, in sadness, in loneliness, or indeed in madness. As I speak, over 500 people a day in Syria and Iraq alone, 100 kilometers from where we are now, are being killed senselessly by one side or another, many of them non-combatants. And the situation is similar in many war zones, or zones of natural calamity or dire poverty or disease all over the world. Women in particular go through moments of this in their natural lives, even the most exalted of them. The prayer of the Blessed Virgin in the Quran, during her contractions, are very telling. She cries in Surah Maryam, verse 23, "Would that I had died before this, and was as nothing, utterly forgotten. ليتني مت قبل هذا وكنت نسيا منسيا." In Islam, the Blessed Virgin is the purest, most innocent, and thus the greatest woman ever to have existed. So this is to say then that absolutely everyone on earth can suffer to such an extent that life is not worth living at all. So we need to first of all be grateful for our lives and for every gift and every moment in our lives. We could also consider that the very fact that we can even think about this and talk about what makes life worth living means that our lives are worth living, and that we must strain every fiber in our being to make it so in practice as well as in theory. I asked, I think you sent this to the students. I asked you all to read Plato's Crito. That's precisely the point that Socrates makes in the Crito 47e to 48b. And I'm quoting. Socrates, Crito speaking, is life worth living? Socrates is speaking to Crito. Is life worth living for us with a body that's in bad condition and that has been corrupted? Crito says, not at all. Then Socrates says, but in that case, is it really worth living if that other part of us is corrupted, the one that injustice maims and justice benefits? Or do we suppose that part of us, whatever it is, to which injustice and justice attach, is less valuable than the body? And then a little later he concludes, it's not living that should be our first priority, but living well. And I think if any single statement summarizes the Life Worth Living lectures, it's that statement of Socrates in the Crito. So, turning now to the question of life worth living itself. Since you're all at Yale and you know your Aristotle well, you remember that at the very beginning of De Anima, I'm just kidding, by the way, I don't expect you to have read Aristotle. Well, but anyway, Aristotle makes the point that before inquiring what knowledge is, we should first inquire as to what the soul is, since that is what contains knowledge. Similarly, before asking what life worth living is, we have to ask what life is. And when we ask what life is, we should not ask, what amoeba life is, or what plant life is, or what the life of a giant cockatoo is, but specifically what human life is. In other words, we have to ask, what is the human condition itself? The human condition. So let us start with some self-evident truths about the human condition. Human beings do not create themselves. They don't create the world. They don't give themselves being or life, or any of their faculties. They cannot keep their beings or their lives for very long. They do not sustain themselves and are in constant need of things from their environment. They need earth to stand on. They wouldn't last 3 seconds without something to stand on. They need air to breathe. They wouldn't last 3 minutes without something to breathe, without air to breathe. They need fire or warmth to sustain their body temperature. They wouldn't last 3 hours without it. They need water to drink. They wouldn't last 3 days without it. And they need food, a lot of food, specifically dead plants and animals from the environment. They wouldn't last 3 weeks without it. Human beings start their terrestrial careers as a microscopic junction of sperm and egg, and end them as rotting corpses, gnawed and devoured bit by insects and worms, unless of course they get eaten by animals or sea life, or they contrive to get themselves burnt to smithereens after they're dead. For all the intervening period between, they carry in themselves a long tube of their own goo and poo that they evacuate daily, and a small sack of their own ghee and pee, which they drain hourly. And throughout this period, their lives, their mouths reek, their noses are full of snot, their bottoms stink, their hearts are time bombs, and their heartbeats are the ticks of their own countdown. Their insides are a horror show, and both their insides and their skin are inhabited by over 1 trillion bacteria. As Ghazali noted, the highest food they can eat is the bee vomit known as honey. Similarly, the highest substance they can wear is the mulberry silkworm secretion known as silk. The highest jewels they adorn themselves are small hardened colored rocks known as precious gems. The highest bedding they can sleep on are dead goose down and feathers known as eider down, and their highest physical pleasure results from the rubbing of their miserable genitals together like a stick and fireboard to kindle a small internal flame, which is then almost immediately extinguished. And yet they spend a good proportion of their adult lives in a fantasy about this process. Their bodies are organic, mobile packs of flesh and bone. Adi Shankar says in the Crest Jewel of Wisdom, he calls this bundles of skin, flesh, fat, bones and filth. And these bodies have the capacity not only to cloud their minds, but worse, to inflict seemingly limitless pain upon them. And even a small thing as slight as an ingrowing toenail will derange most human beings with so much pain that they can't even function normally. And as if all of this weren't significant enough, death hangs over the head of every human being like the sword of Damocles. From the second you're conceived, nothing in the world can guarantee your next breath. The only thing that is guaranteed is the sword, or rather, the Grim Reaper's scythe, which will fall on you at one point, usually when you least expect it, and with it, any even benign worldly hopes you may have will be cut off with finality forever, and at which point you will be wrenched, sniveling and pleading from your body like a tuft of cotton through a thorn bush, as Ghazali has it in the Book of the Remnants of Death. Though you froth with rage against the dying of the light, as Dylan Thomas had it in his memorable phrase, your life is only the time you have whilst you queue up for this implacable guillotine, which is death. You never have your fill of life. You never have your fill of life, and the only thing you'll ever get enough of is the dirt and dust of your own grave. And even what you did achieve or enjoy was in the end never quite as good as your puffed up anticipation and imagination promised, or as the self-entitled pride of our youth dreamed and expected. Moreover, every single second that goes by throughout your life brings you, together with everyone you know, closer to it, like a mad, helpless rush of little lemmings over a brutal cliff to an icy, inevitable, inexorable annihilation, and to your own utter devastation and destruction. And the most you can do about it is watch the process, hapless, hopeless, and helpless. The maximum you will live, and less than 1 in 10 million people achieve this, is to live long enough to be a supercentenarian, that is, living 110 years. And of that time, the first 20 years you'll spend growing up, after 40 years, you'll start to rapidly deteriorate. After 60 years, you'll spend your time continually breaking down in an exhausting and eventually exhaustive planned obsolescence of your body parts and vitality. You spend 1/3 of your time asleep, and at least 2% of it, that is half an hour per day, on the toilet or cleaning yourself or your clothes or your home in some way, so that even if you're never sick and have no unwanted social obligations or duties, that only leaves you with a maximum of 25 years of functional free time. And this is not to mention the time spent eating, drinking, traveling, and maintaining your body through exercise. If you have to work, of course, as 99.9% of the world does, and no doubt should, that leaves you with a maximum of 10 years spare time to make use of freely with your life. As Seneca says, paraphrasing Homer, in his essay, The Shortness of Life, it's a small part of life that we really live. Even then, during that time, those 10 years, though you're externally free, internally, whether you know it or not, and whether you like it or not, and whether you admit it or not, unless you've completely mastered your soul, you're locked in unremitting combat, mortal combat with your constant companion, your own ego, which is forever trying to make you harm your soul or others by dominating them in some way and puffing itself up under whatever excuse it can find. And speaking of others, 100 billion of them, 100 billion others, have already in fact preceded you on this globe. Everyone who was alive until the 20th century, no matter how peaceful, how powerful, how great, how rich, how intelligent, how beloved, how beautiful, how healthy, Everyone who's ever lived has already preceded you into the earth. So that the idea that you or I or any of you are in fact unique, that's a cosmic farce. And you've allowed your ego to dupe you into that. In fact, in all likelihood, every atom in you has already been in hundreds, if not thousands of people, just like you. Not to mention millions of other organisms, and in fact several stars. Moreover, right here and right now, there are 7 billion others jostling over the world with you, and a number of them, listening to their own egos, being actively and perniciously out to get you in particular. They want to get you. As Plato says in the Laws 626d, not only is everyone an enemy of everyone else in the public sphere, but each man fights a private war against himself. Howbeit, even if you were to live 110 years in your prime, in complete freedom, without physical needs and threats from others, or from your own ego, that is nothing compared to the age of the earth or the universe. If the age of the universe were scaled down to 1 year, then a lifetime of 110 years would be shorter than a quarter of a second. A mayfly, which lives 10 hours in a single night, lives 1,000 times longer than that relative to a lifetime of 110 years. So, in a day. In short, your life, however long, is desperately brief. A fray of a wisp, a flicker of a frail candle against a backdrop of unimaginable infinitude. A piece of flotsam on a nameless wave on the surface of infinitude, crashing on the shore of nothingness. And when it's over, whether you're ready for that or not, your whole life, however rich in favors and blessings or satisfactions, whatever pathetic pageantry and parades you have lingered in, will seem to you like it were one day long, or part of a day, or even just an hour, long enough only to meet the people you knew. Indeed, you yourself will seem to yourself like a shadow, a wraith, a distant echo, an illusion, an empty dream in a forgotten grave. As Shakespeare so artfully put it in Macbeth, life's but a walking shadow, a poor player that struts and frets his hour on the stage, and then is heard no more. In objective terms, that's the true human condition, and that's mortal life. One moment you're here, suddenly you're gone forever, as if you'd never flourished here or even ever existed. What I just read was a chapter from a book I'm finishing called The Pentagon Square, where I tried to make the very bleakness of the truth of the human condition funny. But it's actually not, is it? And every second brings the end closer. Islam's answer to life worth living. Islam proceeds from the idea that whilst everything I've just said is true, it's not the whole truth. The whole truth would have to explain not merely what human life is, but what human beings themselves are, and indeed what reality as such is. God says in the Quran, Surah Al-Rum, 37, Surah Al-Rum, 7th verse, they know merely an outer aspect of the life of this world, but they, of the hereafter, they are oblivious. In other words, there's more to ourselves and to reality than this fleeting life. And in fact, the point of this fleeting life is to realize what we really are and to understand the greater reality. God says in the Quran, and warn, for warning prophets, believers. God is saying, I created the jinn and humankind only that they might worship me. I do not desire from them any provision, nor do I desire that they should feed me. Lo, it is God who is the provider, the Lord of strength, the firm. 51, 55 to 58. Worshipping God, according to the authoritative commentary of the Prophet's cousin and student Ibn Abbas, means knowing God. But God, and indeed our own reality and real nature, is known not merely by thought. They require the soul to be virtuous. Knowing God requires the soul to be virtuous. and work virtuous actions. This then leads to faith, and beyond faith to certainty of God, yaqeen. And then finally to the awakening and the vision of the heart. This heart is not the physical heart that pumps blood around your body, but a subtle heart that is the doorway to the spirit. Its ability to see depends on a person's deeds. The Prophet Muhammad ﷺ said, if a servant of God commits a sin, a black spot forms on his heart. And if he changes and repents and asks for forgiveness, his heart is cleansed. But if he relapses, it returns and then it dominates the heart. That's the rast that God mentioned, and then the Prophet ﷺ quotes the Quran. No, indeed, rather that which they have earned is rust upon their hearts. This is Surah 83:14. God also says in the Quran, have they not traveled in the land so that they may have hearts with which to comprehend, or ears with which to hear? Indeed, it is not eyes that are blind, but it is hearts that turn blind within the breasts. Surah Al-Hajj. And similarly, why is he who was dead, and we gave him life, and appointed for him a light by which to walk among people, the same as him whose likeness is in darkness, whence he cannot emerge? The whole religion of Islam, as I've argued in my little book, which Miroslav has, What is Islam and Why, can be understood through the imperative to worship and know God, and hence to know the truth and to know ourselves. For Islam takes not merely the human condition as its starting point, but also what human beings themselves are, with all their faculties and with all their constituent parts. The Prophet ﷺ said that Islam was constructed on 5 things: bearing witness that there is no God but God, but Allah, that Muhammad is his messenger, that's 1, maintaining the prayers, 2, giving tithe, zakat, 3, pilgrimage to Mecca, Hajj, 4, and fasting the month of Ramadan, 5. Thus, the inner meaning of the 2 testimonies of faith is acknowledgement of God, and they are an act of both the will and the intelligence. The inner meaning of the 5 canonical daily prayers, salah, is attachment to God, and they are an act of the human soul and many of its faculties, including speech, the imagination, memory, learning, and also it's an act of the body. Another part of prayers, an indivisible part of prayers, are ablutions, which, as it were, serve to reattach, to purify and reattach the limbs towards God and detach a person from his ego and previous sins, thereby also necessarily involving the conscience. The inner meaning of zakah, giving tithe, obviously is detachment from the world, and it's an act of sentiment. The inner meaning of fasting, siyam, is detachment, and obviously detachment from the body and the ego, and it is an act of the body and the ego. The inner meaning of pilgrimage is to return to one's own heart, and is thus an act of the heart. And in fact, the Kaaba that you see in Mecca, for Muslims, that is an external image of the heart. The black shrouded Kaaba is an image of the mystery of the heart. So in other words, human beings are comprised of a mortal body with 5 senses, a soul which comprises an ego and a conscience and a number of other faculties, such as sentiment and feelings and will and intellect, faculty of speech, faculty of learning and of imitation, imagination, memory, sense, insight, and intuition, and a heart which is a doorway to the spirit. All of these faculties are addressed and involved in the 5 pillars of Islam. Islam is itself thus a providentially perfect strategy that engages and transforms every faculty and every part of human beings in quest of its spiritual goal. Islam is thus based on human nature as such. God says to the Prophet ﷺ in the Quran, then we set you on a clear course of the commandment, so follow it, and do not follow the desires of those who don't know. It remains merely to be said that the centerpiece of Islam, its 5 pillars as such, it remains to be said that this centerpiece, the 5 pillars of Islam, is merely the centerpiece of Islam. There's other aspects to Islam, but both the outer aspects and the inner aspects of Islam are, as it were, harnessed to the same goal. If we consider that the outermost aspect of Islam is the Sharia, the Islamic law, as regards society, then that is the way that society, as it were, is harnessed to that spiritual goal. And the same thing for the Sunnah. If we consider that the inner aspect of Islam, that is the way, the Sunnah is the way that we approach virtue. And voluntary devotions, nawafil, which is the sort of the essential Sunnah, we might say, is the purpose is to deepen the spiritual quest. This is all summarized in this very famous hadith al-Nawafil, where God says, "Nothing is more beloved to me as a means for my servant to draw near unto me than the worship which I have made binding on him. But my servant ceases not to draw closer and closer to me with added voluntary devotions of his own free will until I love him or her, of course. And when I love him, I am the hearing with which he hears, and I am the sight with which he sees, and I am the hand with which he grasps, and I am the foot whereon he walks." It remains to be said that the Quran has many near synonyms for those who have truly fulfilled the purpose of their existence and lived a life worth living, such as the word faizun, the winners. But none of those synonyms fits the meaning more exactly than the word falah, to be successful. Etymologically, the word falah means to split, and hence to sow and also to reap. The word occurs many times, dozens of times in the Quran, but perhaps none summarizes the entire question of life worth living and the quintessence of all religion, including, par excellence, Islam, as the following passage in the Quran. God says, "Successful indeed is he who purifies himself and remembers the name of his Lord and prays. Nay, but you prefer the life of this world, whereas the hereafter is better and more lasting. Truly this is in the former scrolls, the scrolls of Abraham and Moses." So, in conclusion, the all-important question of life worth living cannot be ignored if one has the supreme gift of being able to ask it. For ignoring it would automatically mean wasting life and making it not worth living precisely. But it cannot be answered without knowing what human life is and what human beings are. One may not come to understand human life with the mind alone, but one can never gain insight into oneself without self-purification. So, what I'm saying is, you will never believe in God just by thinking about God or reading theology or listening to lectures. Your faith will increase as your good deeds increase, because that will make your heart stronger and the light in your heart stronger, and it will remove the rust on your heart. So to know, you have to also do and be. In Plato's Phaedrus and in a number of other Socratic dialogues, Socrates quotes the oracle at Delphi, "Know thyself." And we would like to add that this quest to know thyself involves your every act and your whole being, body, soul, and heart, during every single moment for the rest of your life. Thank you.
Thank you very much for this wonderful, stimulating, witty, and profound lecture at the same time. God, prayer, eternal life. Many people, when they think about life worth living today, these aren't the things that first come to their minds. And even when one reminds them of transience, of fragility, of bleakness of human existence, it may not quite lead them to give up the attachment to ordinary life. What is the place of ordinary life in the vision that you have just sketched for us? Ordinary pleasures of life.
Well, there is no, Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala says, flee to God. So flee unto God, firu ilallah. There is no ordinary life. Every moment can be special through remembrance of God, through consecrating that moment, through doing our very mundane, what you're calling ordinary lives. Every moment can be made special simply by remembering the name of God before and after, thanking God, doing it for God rather than for your own ego. So this way, mundane life becomes sacralized, becomes beautiful, becomes worthwhile. It becomes, when you think of God, who is, and I'm saying this may sound like an academic concept, but I mean it in an existential way. When you think of God, who is beyond time and space, as it were, you yourself make that moment in which you're thinking of God beyond time and space, and you will know that moment and stay with that moment. That moment will stay with you for eternity. When you think of the infinite, absolute, beautiful eternity, that is in God, you will, as it were, emerge from your smallness, limitedness, imperfection, and as it were, be with God through the remembrance of Him. Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala says in the Quran, remember me, I will remember you. When you're remembered by God, you're eternal, because God is eternal.
So in a sense, orientation toward God, sort of fleeing to God, in some ways, one may put it this way, returns oneself and the world to one in a new way. Did I understand you rightly? Yeah. So that all the experiences of ordinary life become in some sense suffused by something extraordinary in the act of a soul's attachment to God. Would that be a way to say it?
Yeah, I mean, it's a new heaven and new earth right here in this world. Remembrance of God is the life of the heart. It's a new heaven, new earth, a new world. In the mundanity of the world, it's transformative.
So it's not denial of the self or denial of the world in a sense, but affirmation in a new and richer way.
Denial of which self? Of your true self? It's an affirmation of your true self, which is beyond your false self, which is the ego.
Right. Related to this, I was struck by how you described the Virgin Mary in Islam, and similarly, she's thought of in Christianity. You stressed her purity, her innocence, and then you said, and therefore, and thus, I believe was the word that you used, she was the greatest of all women. We tend to think of geniuses as great. Einstein is great. We tend to think of people with fame or famous people as great. We tend not to think today as innocent, pure people as the greatest. Can you comment on that?
Yeah. There's nothing great in any of us. All of us, the more we puff ourselves up with our petty egos, the less great we are. So those who are truly great are the ones who are emptiest of themselves. The Blessed Virgin was the most empty person, the purest person, and therefore the greatest person, the greatest woman ever to have existed in the Islamic point of view. And even the Prophet ﷺ, his title is Abdullah. Abdullah means the servant. He was pure servant, pure effacement, pure servanthood. And through that pure effacement was his greatness, because the more empty we are, the more, as it were, God fills us. I don't know if this is the correct way of, fills us with His grace.
I don't know whether you're familiar, but Pope Emeritus Benedict XVI, throughout his writings, especially in his introduction to Christianity, thought of greatness just in those terms that you've described, to the extent that we empty ourselves of ourselves and make space in ourselves as a pure vessels of God. Just to that extent we are great. So there's something between our traditions. There's something similar in that regard.
Yes, and there's many similar. I think on those spiritual questions, you'll find the spiritual questions regards the soul and spiritual practice, and certainly combating the ego. I think you'll find a large confluence in those, and that doesn't surprise me at all. All my readings, of course, in Christianity, in Christian mysticism, and of course Jewish mysticism, and even in other sacred traditions, I found an enormous amount of common ground there.
So in mystical traditions, you will find that there may be differences with some other aspects of the tradition. You know, I was going to ask you, most of your lecture was organized or oriented around, starting with Crito's text, around what we have described in our course as leading life well, a kind of active side of life. We, in the Life Worth Living course, we talk about two other aspects of the good life. One is life going well for one, a certain measure of health, maybe certain satisfaction of hunger, certain needs, basic human needs being satisfied at least, or whatever that might be. Different traditions may emphasize different things, or even very much modern fascination with ordinary life might be enhancing these, how life goes for us. That's the second one. So first, life being led well, second, life going well, and third was a kind of emotional dimension of life feeling good. In Christian tradition, we speak of joy. Can you comment on these other two sides, the sense you have already about life going well, but can you comment on these other two sides, aspects of life, of the good life?
Yes. I mean, Islam doesn't deny sentiment, and doesn't deny the needs of sentiment, the needs of the soul, the need for love, and doesn't deny the need for the body and the inability of most people to bear calamities in those aspects. That's why I started with that. But as regards the soul and feeling, what I would say is, I didn't mention this in this lecture, but of course I mentioned this, talk a lot about this in my book on Love and the Holy Quran. Happiness, and we talked about this in our consultation on joy. So there's no happiness without love. There's no love without giving. So you think you'll never be happy just by getting stuff and things going well for you in the normal way. You'll only be happy, some people call it job satisfaction, but you'll only be happy when you're giving and when you're loving. You'll only, the happiness, the kind of pleasure that the ego derives from getting stuff, from dominating, from winning, from being famous, from being rich, from being powerful, from being this, there's a kind of pleasure, but it's not happiness, and it won't last.
But there is a kind of positive feeling attendant to the right living, right? Positive sentiment that attends it. Would that be the case?
Yes. I mean, if you're doing your best, I mean, you don't have to be praying all day, but if you're just doing your best in small things, even if you're just doing your best, as a student, or you're just working hard, you're doing your best, there's a kind of joy that comes from the gratitude of having given yourself, even in a small way. So that sentiment, of course, gratitude is a sentiment. That kind of joy, of course, is a sentiment. That's a very important sentiment because it gives us the strength to carry on, to keep giving.
I was struck by the end of your lecture, and also in the middle there were sections that talked about our hearts, our intellects being blind, and somehow almost like a veil needing to be taken off from our eyes. Otherwise we aren't able to perceive actually what true content of the good life is.
Well, I mean, in the Christian tradition, Jesus says a similar thing, if not exactly the same thing. He says, "Blessed are the pure in heart, for they shall see God." It's different, because the whole question of seeing God is something that Muslim theologians have debated about. Certainly, there's a vision of God in the afterlife, and Muslim theologians have debated whether. Of course, the vast majority says we don't see God we don't see God physically, but is there a vision of God or through God, or from God with the heart. And there is a vision from God and through God with the heart. As I mentioned in that Hadith Qudsi, that holy Hadith, that's what that Hadith is showing. So I think there's a lot of convergence there as well.
But there's a contrast to maybe more secular modes of thinking, where you are supposed to discern, for instance, in well-being studies, you discern how people act, you analyze what gives them certain forms of satisfaction. It seems like by empirical observation, you can come to understand what it means to live a good life, the good life.
That's madness. You see, in reality,
Madness.
it's just madness. It's just a sheer myopic madness. And you think you're looking at something, but actually the joke's on you. In fact, all those people who think they're looking at something else, they're not looking at themselves. They're not looking inside themselves. If you just take time to be alone and watch your thoughts for a few days, and probably most people can't do it for a few hours, but if you just take 2 or 3 days and watch what's coming into your soul, where your thoughts are coming from, you will quickly see that your soul is like your mind, that space of your mind, so it's like a television, and there are different impulses coming. And these are recurring impulses, and they're not innocent impulses. And until you know how to discern where each of those is coming from, what it wants, what the driving factors, and what the patterns in your own memory and soul are, and in your body, then you will not know yourself. And so you'll think that you have some kind of knowledge of this other dream, which is the world, whereas you don't even understand that you yourself are the dream, and that the real you is not that psychic chatter that's bombarding you day and night, and that you're acting upon like a robot, really.
Mm. And today, I suppose there's an additional layer to it. We don't live simply in the kind of dream of the perceived ordinary material life. We live also in a dream superimposed on that of virtual reality. And a lot of people spend a lot of time distracted by varieties of gadgets. What do you advise? How does one get to the sources of the self, so to speak, surrounded by the distractions of ordinary living?
Well, that's a dream, that's an illusion with an illusion with an illusion. What did Shakespeare say about, what did Churchill say about Russia? He said it's a puzzle within an enigma within a Thames Court. Anyway, so, that's, people are spending 7 hours a day watching movies, watching television, tweeting rubbish, following silly famous people's tweets, about sheer rubbish, what they ate that day, what they think about this, what they think about that, wasting their lives on the social media, wasting their lives on movies, which is an illusion with illusion, and never knowing themselves, never knowing their own hearts, and unable to break the addiction, the domination of the virtual world upon themselves. If you think about this, Mr. Most people in the West, and in countries like Saudi Arabia, they're spending 7 hours a day, 7 to 8 hours a day. If you add up video games, plus television and media, plus social media, plus YouTube videos, you're speaking 7 to 8 hours a day for most people. Now, your job is 7 to 8 hours a day. So you're doing 7 to 8 hours a day of that. What time does that leave? And you're sleeping 7 to 8 hours a day. What does that leave for family? What does that leave for human interaction? What does that leave for you? It leaves zero. It means you've contrived with this worldwide spider to exhaust your life and spend it doing absolutely nothing that's going to stay with you after the veil of the body and this life are gone. It's a kind of a thief of your time, and that's an even bigger madness than the normal ego.
Thank you for this time with us. Thank you for nudging us to find our deeper selves and lead a life worth living.